Hey, Tim, after a couple of weeks break, I almost forgot how to turn this Zoom thing on.
Well, I guess your computer remembered how to do it because that
Yeah,
was pretty clean login for you. How are you doing? How was break, by the way?
it was good. We took a little vacation, a little summertime, a little relaxing up in the Northwest. Had some great weather. Did some foraging on the ocean for crab and seafood, and we just had a nice time. Just a nice break. How about yourself? Were you busy during the time?
Yeah. I started a new project having me help in the review and recommendations for their upcoming changes to the CAPM credential training content, basically self-learning material where people want the CAPM. And second of all, it looks like I'm going to be an adjunct professor in the spring again. So I'm going to have to dust off my syllabus and see if I can make that better too. So I'm going to be around, and I'm going to continue to be studying this stuff with you with the intent of what I learn. Maybe, the people around me can get value too.
Well, it's good. Let's see if I can do this segue, Tim. So, with all of that, you're going to have to learn how to tailor your material.
Oh boy.
How's that for a segue to today's
That was
topic on
perfect.
tailoring?
That was perfect. And you're right. You're right. Because, my stakeholders, some of my stakeholders say that the CAPM should be written, the training material should be written for students like high school students, and other decision makers are saying that it should be written for people who are actually participating in projects too. So you can imagine the modification has to go to make each one of those fit.
Oh, absolutely. So, why don't we get started on this topic? Because to me, this is near and dear to my heart. In the 40 years or so that I spent in project work, both as a practitioner and as a project manager, tailoring was one of the things that we actually, after some time, put directly into our methodology. The company I worked for had its own methodologies, which are based on a lot of other methodologies, but nonetheless, we actually added tailoring right into the methodology. And
Wow.
and part of that came from a project that we did back, and oh my goodness, this goes back many years, but we did it under the auspices of the US federal government for a state. Now, the way that this happened to work is the federal government did a lot of the financing to benefit the state. We put the project in, and it was successful enough such that the federal government said, can we take that exact model and put it into other states? And as a result of that, we said, well, we can try. Now we had to, interestingly enough, we had to bid for the privilege of being able to transfer, I'll use the word transfer, our solution to another jurisdiction. But naturally, we won that, and we were very successful in transferring. But here's the tailoring aspect of that. While the federal rules governing the solution were the same for all states, every state had its own kind of unique rules. And as a result of that, when we went to the second state with the transferred solution, we did a lot of tailoring to our methodology, to the solution itself, and even some to the technology. So yeah, it's near and dear to my heart. And ever since then, we've put that as part of our normal methodology in every project.
That's funny. You actually said that tailoring was something that became a formal part of project management through experience. I when I went back for my research, I actually went back to the 6th edition of the PMBOK. It's no longer in publication, but I went to my copy and I found 3 paragraphs where they talk about tailoring. And now with the 7th edition of the Body of Knowledge, all of a sudden we're up to 34 pages. So I think PMI at the same time, the same way in the manner as you, is actually saying this is a lot more important than we thought it was.
Oh, it is important. And as I was doing my research for today's subject matter, I went back and thought about it, and I thought, we didn't just fall into it. We didn't have a name for it. And I think we called it common sense back then.
Yeah. Yeah. What is it? Is it the appropriate modification based on the unique needs of the project or the plan or the deliverable, right?
Oh, absolutely. In fact,
And
it's more than appropriate. I think it's demanded in some cases.
yeah, it's necessary. And again, when you go into the 7th edition of the body of knowledge, it's like, this is what we recognize as, good targets for tailoring. These are the ones that are good. One of the things that I noticed early on when people are just getting into formally studying project management, they get introduced to the body of the knowledge and they think it's a bunch of rules. By the way, my coach was brilliant. And he said, don't think of it as about a bunch of rules and regulations. Think of it as a group of standards. Think of it as a group of things that we've gathered over the last 200 years. And if you do things this way, you're going to get a better than average response. Now, that's the body of knowledge. That's the standard. But the thing is, sometimes we do have to tailor. And that's what we're looking at.
And by using it as a standard, a book of standards rather than a book of rules, or as I like to say, a guidance book, it invites tailoring of itself. And I think the very first part of the definition of tailoring in the 7th edition of the body of knowledge is that each project is unique. And if that's the case, now I don't know that we fell into it or if we were just good common sense people, but when you transfer a solution from one jurisdiction to another, it's not cookie cutter. It's not like, buying the next Malibu off the line at the GM plant. You have to tailor it for the desires and the needs and the requirements of the accepting jurisdiction.
Yeah, and again, let's even get more general. Each project may or may not have a business analyst or have a product owner or have, even a recognized sponsor as an individual. They may have an organization that sponsors.
Yeah.
And so we have to have these general approaches too that actually do that. They have the rules and regulations of the organization and the government. We have process documents from the organization that says this is the way you're going to do things. And then we have the requirements of the deliverable and the project itself. And then within that, everybody has their own needs and expectations. And you can't get this balanced, successful result without that ongoing modification.
Well, and even in the example that I gave you, it would have been great if we could have just picked up the solution and put it, from one jurisdiction to another. It would have been great. Now, it would have been a very small project for us, not very profitable because it would have been that small. But when we went to the new jurisdiction, not only were some of the state-only requirements different that we had to tweak, but think about this. The state required its own methodology for how they document the rules around the system itself. So we had to take all of our documentation from the donor system and put it into the format of the new system, of the new jurisdiction that we were transferring the system to. The implementation, for example, now the training material we could almost lift, except we had to tweak the training material where we had tweaked the solution. But the jurisdiction that we were transferring to was very disparate. It was the state of Hawaii. So that the state of Hawaii is made up of several islands. So we had to change our entire implementation approach to take into account the islands, which were not, you couldn't just drive city to city. We had to deal with, island hopping in that way. So yeah, we have to tailor every single aspect, or we have to look to tailor every single aspect of the project.
This actually is something that would be really of interest to my students. So here you are, you have a successful implementation, and somebody in a new environment says, we want you to do the same thing, but for us.
Right.
So here is the question. What details do you gather? Just generally, we don't have to get in specifics, but what generally do you look for in order to figure out this is what I can tailor and this is what I can't?
Yeah, so a few things that I've already mentioned, I guess, in terms of the requirements. Are the requirements exactly the same? Because I can't just lift the solution from one place to another and hope to meet the requirements if there are some differences. So I have to look at what that delta is in terms of perhaps requirements that I need to leave out, as well as requirements I need to bring in that are different between the two jurisdictions. I'm safe where the federal government required us to do certain things no matter which state I'm in. So there I was safe. That was one in the requirements, and that's kind of where I like to live. But a second one is technology. We were in an ADA-based environment. What did the state of Hawaii have? Turns out it had ADA-based, but had they had something else, that would have also been a tailoring requirement. You know, they might have had a whole different database structure. For example, some states in those days were working on IMS, some were working on DB2, some were working on IDMS. So all of those became candidates. But that's just two. And I don't want to keep talking because there's several more. But what's your perspective?
It's the same. And it even gets more discreet for me, because on a lot of projects, I was not just the project manager, but I was a financial analyst. And all of a sudden you have finance. Now, if you've ever studied finance and accounting, like you said, there's some general laws that you have to follow, laws and regulations. Says you will report in this structure. You will lay out details in this structure. So generally accepted accounting principles have those things that won't change from client to client. But as you said, you know, when you start working with individual corporations, each finance department is going to have their way of interpreting GAAP, where they respond out in that manner, and you get to fulfill the needs of that individual finance organization. We call those things business requirement. And it's not just finance. It gets into, you know, the whole invoicing process. It gets way beyond just information sharing. And it goes down to even the fact that, you know, we sometimes have to tailor the big things, not just the small things.
Yeah, we've been in situations where we've bid solutions, and one of the RFP requirements for any bidder, and especially for the winning bidder, was that you had to adopt your processes to the jurisdiction's methodology. And that's fine. I mean, typically people say, well, methodology is methodology, but sometimes it's not. Sometimes it's fairly foreign. And so then you have to tailor or deliberately adapt your methodology, in this case, to what the client requires if you want the business.
You know what's, boy, you just really triggered something in my head there. This is a big deal, what you just said. Can you repeat what you said?
So to make it really short, the customer demanded that the winning bidder use the customer's methodology for developing systems, even if we had our own proprietary methodology.
There we go. Now, you think this is a cut and dried, you think this is a cut and dried discussion, right? All they have to do is lay out methodology, you look at the variances and you're good, right? Here's the problem. When we talk about methodologies, we talk about pieces of work and unique skills and how we schedule those pieces of work with those skills across the life of a project, right?
Yeah.
Now, think about this. I've had some clients that say, we map it across planning, executing, monitoring, controlling, and closing. And then I've had other clients that say, no, we don't look at it that way. We look at it at mapping across user interface, business intelligence, and database. And so we have to be ready to actually be able to modify not just, what's under contract, but modify this whole mindset, both ours and the clients, so we can come to a common understanding of what we mean by doing this work, not just getting the work done.
Well, and think about the example that I opened with when we transferred that system. When we built the first system, we went through a traditional requirements gathering and requirements validation process. When we transferred it, now we were bringing requirements with us. So we had to change our entire requirements gathering process, methodology, techniques, tools, to not only indoctrinate or initiate our new client to how the system worked and what requirements were within it, but then also to understand what the delta was in terms of what they saw was missing from their perspective, or what they saw was extraneous from their perspective, so that we could make those modifications. So suddenly requirements gathering went from a traditional approach to a whole new process in terms of education and validation or modification. It was fun times.
So you know what? That means that it's going to take a little more time. First of all,
actually, it took less time because of the number of requirements that were already well established.
Okay. Yeah. Okay. That's actually nice to know.
Yeah.
But the thing is, you have an outcome and a deliverable that's going to be more satisfactory, right? Because number one, they have something they know that you can deliver. They have more confidence in you. And the pieces that they don't have confidence yet, you have that covered to a deeper level of understanding. I think we're getting into why tailoring is important for projects.
Right. Well, and when you laid out the question, you said in terms of what details do we gather, a couple other things that we looked at very carefully whenever we did any project was what is the client saying that they are going to lend to the project? Are we going to get full-time subject matter experts for the duration? Or are we going to have to rely on part-time sort of hit and run participation? So even from that perspective, that changes our approach in terms of how it is just relying on customers' subject matter experts.
Right.
So staffing could be one of those things that we look at as well.
Yeah. And again, this I think that I've seen it all in tailoring. I think I've tailored everything on projects until I get a new client.
Yeah.
And they say, well, we can't lend anybody. All we have is this documentation and this data. Why don't you start with that? And once you've gone through that, we'll start up a meeting with the most available experts, and we'll have a conversation about what we can do from there.
And by the way, we're right now undergoing some cutbacks, so we can't even authorize overtime. So you've got to fit it into their already busy schedule. But let me give you one more that I think is often overlooked. Tailoring based on lessons learned.
Yeah.
You see how that kind of opens up? I mean, I think PMBOK 7 is tailoring based on lessons learned all the way from PMBOK 1.
Yeah, it to a great extent it is. It's actually a refinement of what we've learned from history. Yeah. You're exactly right.
One of the projects I was on recently had 3 major programs within it. And what the client decided to do was to begin with the smallest program that affected the fewest people. And they were also instituting agile process for the first time in any kind of big way. And so what we did after that was after we implemented, we dissected lessons learned. Actually, that's not right. We dissected lessons learned all along the way, so that when the second program was being developed, we already had some changes or tailoring to the methodology. And then when the third one came around, we were even better at it. So I think lessons learned is a huge thing to look at when we consider tailoring on any project.
Oh, yeah. Let's switch gears.
Okay.
Is there anything about a project or its activities that will state you won't tailor? Either you won't tailor this project, you'll do it, copy exact, or these are the aspects of this project that you will not tailor under any situation. Where have you had that actually stated to you, or where have you experienced that?
Well, I think you've already given the example without knowing it. One example, and that is the whole generally accepted accounting principles. We can put in a chart of accounts, we can put in accounts receivable, we can put in any kind of system we want, but there is non-negotiable in terms of adhering to generally accepted accounting principles.
Right, laws and regulations.
Laws
Okay,
and regulations.
let's have that, and then we have finance and other business requirements, which basically are regulation and policy inside the company. Yeah. So those are hands off. You're gonna have to have those done the way they are. Period.
I can give you a couple others.
Yeah, go ahead.
They're kind of. You end up with a stakeholder who is tied to his 5 or her 5 favorite reports. And it doesn't matter how good your solution is, he or she wants their 5 favorite reports exactly as laid out as they've always been used to it. That becomes a non-negotiable, even if it doesn't make sense. So you do it.
You know what? We've invented a new category, okay? It's individual habits and group culture.
Yeah.
I think those two things, they're very similar. Mm-hmm. Where an individual has habits and don't change my habits, like you said, this is the report I always use, and I need that to report to my management or to my executives. And second of all, culture. Unless you have a CEO or a staff on the CEO or board of directors telling you this is the way we're going to change culture, culture is almost impossible to modify, and you don't want to anyway when you're working at consulting.
No, that's true. And another one, quite frankly, and that my history has been, excuse me, every job we've won, we had to bid. Uh-huh. And the bids came out with certain requests for proposals. And there were certain non-negotiables in those requests for proposals because the customer wanted to lay a level playing field across all of the potential bidders. So even if you have a better idea, you still had to adhere to the customer's requirements because they needed to be able to evaluate on a level playing field. So those became non-negotiable, non-tailorable aspects.
So we have contracts, and yes, whether the contracts affirm, regulation and standard with law, or is just policy, or if it's just a cultural mores that we have to follow. Anything under contract will say you can't tailor here. This is what we have to do.
Absolutely. And by the way, I have a question for you now. Mm-hmm. We just talked about where we can't tailor, but what are some of the more popular areas where we do tailor that are absolute subjects for tailoring?
I'm going to start at the very, very high level. Okay. Uncertainty, where things are really undefined. Yeah. We've never done this before. And that's the ultimate in tailoring, right? You still have to work within these constraints, these environmental factors like laws and policies and everything else. But everybody is on board to say, okay, we're going to have to figure out new ways of doing it. And that's, like I said, that's probably the first level of tailoring that we need to address.
No, that's exactly right. Because, and we're going to probably get into this a little later, because tailoring isn't just a one-time event at the beginning of a project. It's one of those things that becomes an ongoing process. And so what you just talked about was, as the uncertainty becomes more certain, you're always tweaking or perhaps making some wholesale changes.
Yeah, and actually you can think of adaptive methodology as an ongoing definition of your requirements. And as you establish those requirements, they become the constraints. And so you can see, especially with adaptive projects, the tailoring may actually trail this clarification refinement of the project.
Yeah, I mean, think of your iPhone or think of your Android. That's been a what would you say, a career in tailoring for many people.
Oh yeah, and you think about the manufacturers. Early in with Galaxy, with the early models, they were saying, what can we do with this? And they were looking at different use models. And now that those use models are in place for all, we all use smartphones the same way now, right? So they have that constraint, that limitation, but now they're looking at, refinement within that.
So just before my wife and I left on vacation, our hot water tank in the home blew. And, this day and age, trying to get a plumber out to your home to fix it. Now, I happen to have my plumber on speed dial because we own some other properties, but nonetheless, when we got this person out to replace our hot water tank, I was watching carefully at how they did their process, and they got to the point where they had to turn the water off to the home and discover that because the home that we're now living in is an older part of town, they have to have the city come out and turn the water off at the street. There's no sort of magical big thing you turn to turn off the water at the home. You have to wait for the city. And I'm thinking, oh boy, here my bill is about to go way up while they wait for whenever the city arrives, right?
Right.
Well, so we're waiting for the city worker to come and turn the water off. I'm watching these two guys, and they start soldering they start measuring, they start soldering what they needed to do. They start creating or outfitting the hot water tank. They start building the stand. They do all of this stuff. And the moment they finished, the city worker arrived and shut the water off.
Oh,
All
wow.
they do was put it into place, solder everything together, and the city worker then turned the water on again. And what I was thinking is they tailored the schedule based on what happened at that moment. And I think that's one of those areas that we as project managers are always looking to do, is to figure out ways to perhaps parallel processes or do something with our tasks so that we can continue to improve upon the schedule.
Yeah, we basically eliminating issues and obstacles. And in your case, it wasn't a functionality obstacle. It was a value and satisfaction obstacle. That's a really mature approach and attitude.
Yeah. And they didn't run out my bill.
Do you have any other general areas in planning that are common targets for tailoring?
Yeah, I do actually. The implementation. It used to be we did all of our training for implementation live, classroom style. And what we've discovered now that a lot of the technology has surpassed what we're able to do in the classroom, we can do a lot more through video, through sort of little vignettes, through Zoom training, through whatever. We actually are able to cut down our costs and give just as effective training using some of the newer technologies. So in planning training for implementation, we've been able to absolutely improve upon how it is that we deliver that training.
As a classroom and a remote teacher, it's really easy for me, if we're running out of time, is to offload these concepts like little kernels of knowledge or little tools, offload them, like you said, into a little vignette, like an 8-minute or 15-minute YouTube, and say, hey, we don't have time for this, but let me give you this link, and this will be part of your assignment over the weekend. Just check this out and answer these questions. And you're right. It lends itself to much flexibility. And by doing this, I've been able to actually have more extended conversations on the general concepts and leave the self-learning for these things that are not so necessarily critical, yet people will want to study them, and they add a little bit of context.
Well, and the other side of that, what we've also discovered, particularly since the pandemic, a lot of organizations are strapped for staff. And so their staff are dealing with their public, with their customers on an 8-hour basis every single day. And so they don't have a lot of, you can't pull 40 people out of their offices and put them in a classroom for 5 days. it just doesn't work in terms of their own customer service. So we've had to tailor our approaches to be able to deal with people so that they can do their day jobs and prepare for the new system at the same time, while still, kind of being immersed in everything that they do in a way that makes sense.
This is not a transformation in technology here. This is a transformation in methodology. We didn't have to learn new tools to learn how to tailor in different way. It's just through experience and capturing what's worked with other projects. And this is big.
Yeah. Well, and I like the way I think I was reading, I think it was in version 7 of the PMBOK, when it talked about the fact that this is tailoring really can be defined as it's a deliberate approach of sort of your whole governance process, any kind of processes, to make them more suitable for the environment and the work at hand. And sometimes the work at hand dictates that deliberate adaptation, because if you do it the same old way every time, you're going to lose in some of those areas, because not every situation is relevant to what it is that you've done over and over again before.
Exactly. Now, there's one last thing I want to think about here with you. One general rule for tailoring is, it seems to me, if you tailor earlier and set the course with your tailoring, it makes it less costly and less time-consuming later. It's not so much as a fix. It's like piloting a ship. If you can actually start off your journey in generally the right direction, and then you're going to need fewer course corrections based on, what the storms that come up and the weather that happens and other things that happen out on the ocean, right? And the same thing with projects. If we can actually start this tailoring, in a broader way early in the project, in the lesser way, I'm thinking, I haven't worked this out. I haven't done the math on this, but it seems to me that the tailoring later on in the project, if we do it well in the beginning, can actually be done in a more refined or a more minimal level later. What does that sound like to you?
Yeah, I have a couple observations in that area, just because I've experienced this. And I think at some point we're going to be asking, or at the end, we probably will end this podcast as we normally do and say, what can a up and coming project manager do to kind of prepare themselves? So that's exactly right. A mature project manager who has years of experience behind them can look at a situation and say, I need to adapt this to the situation I'm in. And the only way they can do that is because they are constantly, from project charter on, they're constantly looking for ways to improve, to tailor, to adapt, to change, to whatever it is. And if you as a project manager aren't doing that for throughout the whole project, then you are missing the boat. Because there's, as you said, if you can pick up on something early in the project, as opposed to having to, months later, make a change, that change is going to be far more expensive by not adapting earlier or tailoring earlier than later. So what you said is exactly correct.
Good.
It's the same old thing. If you're catching all of your errors during system testing, you have failed. You need to be desk checking during requirements definition and all the way through. So it's the same sort of concept.
Yeah. That, what? The way you explained it was much more clear than the way I approached it. So
yeah, I'm not sure. I'm going to have to go over the transcript and see if I explained it well as well as I. What's up in here doesn't always come out here as well as I want it to. But
yeah. Oh no, it came across real clear for me.
Okay.
So one of the hurdles that I've seen a lot of my students facing is not necessarily what to tailor or how to tailor, but it's actually how to have confidence to go in and say, you know what, let's change that. Let's change that. How do you actually set up a young project manager or even a team lead or a team member to say, hey, you know what? This actually can be a lot more value if we change this?
That's a great question. So let me tell you how not to do it.
Okay.
When I was 6 years old, we went down to the river that went through our farm to go for a swim, and my dad threw me in the deep end.
Mm-hmm.
Now, that's not a good way to teach someone, and he had to come in after me, but I learned eventually. So what I'm saying is, we don't start these young up and coming project managers by throwing them in the deep end immediately. I think what we do is we allow them to come to us with tailoring ideas and bounce them off more mature project managers and say, do you think this will work? Or can you see any flaws in how it is that I want to approach this? So I think there's several ways, but I think the number one way is to throw them into at least the shallow end, but then also mentor them, give them some lessons, and keep that mentoring aspect alive throughout the project.
And give them permission to say,
yeah.
I think,
Yeah.
give them permission to have an opinion.
Yeah.
I remember one of my favorite supervisors, and I used to say, can I do this? And he said, sure. I give you permission to drive a truck over the cliff, and you're going to actually live with the results of that. But I'll talk to you about what it means to drive that truck off the cliff and what you get at the end, because I want you to start going through the logic in your own head so that you can do this also when I'm not around. That was somebody who, he didn't have the formal training like I do, but man, he had the common sense.
Well, and I was thinking about this too as you formulated your question, because this is dealing with students in your classes who are either in project management roles in more junior levels or want to improve their skills. Do I have that correct?
Oh yeah, that's
so
right.
Maybe one way to approach that is just to reassure them that and by the time they got to this point in their career, as practitioners in the computer science field, in the implementation field, or whatever field they're in, they've already had to do a lot of problem solving. And to do that problem solving, they've had to rely on their own creativity. They've had to deal with the unknowns. They've had to deal with the undefined areas and come up with creative approaches. I think they just take that already well-disciplined approach to project management and not be afraid of making decisions, or at least bouncing them off of their superiors.
This is one of the most difficult things to do in your career as a project manager. Early in your career, we talk about this all the time, right? It's rules and tools.
Yeah.
See, you have your confidence as an external tool or action or activity. If I do it right this way, I am successful. As you grow and mature into a senior project manager, that confidence in the tools has to, by nature of the work that you get into, be integrated in who you are. And we're not talking anymore about a focus on confidence through your expertise. It's confidence through your understanding of how humans act and behave. It's not necessarily, what experts I bring to the table. It's how we work together as a group to basically manage risk, manage quality, be proactive, and think together.
Well, and that thinking together is also something that in my past life that we adapted, because I'd mentioned earlier that tailoring is something you don't do just once at the beginning of the project, but you continue to do it. And back when we did more predictive projects, where we use the waterfall methodology, we put in at the end of each phase, before we began the next one, a review of how it is that we finished, or how we completed the last phase, and what it is that we needed to do to carry forward, and where we could tailor in the next phase. And in doing that, we would bring together our leads so that we would come to a common understanding. And here's what's interesting. We got a lot of great ideas from the leads because they were closer to the process than we were as senior project managers. And because they could bring that closeness to the discussion, we had a lot more creative approaches to actually doing the tailoring for the next phase. But it was a communal discussion. It was not necessarily always a consensus, but certainly they felt part of it. And because they felt part of it, two things happened. One, they learned for their next time when they became more senior. But secondly, they were more committed to the end goal because they were part of that process.
Yeah, they're part. They've actually placed a part of who they were as part of the decision.
Yeah,
that's brilliant. So you're actually talking about integration not just as a process in planning, but a interactive component of ongoing management of the project. It's part of execution and monitoring, controlling. And we can see how, the way you're talking, a lot of things were triggering off in my head too. It seems like tailoring has to do a lot with change management. It has a lot to do with configuration management, right? Using the feedback cycle of the analysis of the data. And so tailoring actually is, like you said, and you've said it about 3 times, it's not just a one, it's not just a one process activity.
Well, and think about our audience who are involved in agile projects. Every sprint, you do a what? You do a ceremony at the end that you look back at what you did well and what you could improve upon. And if you're not using those ceremonies to improve the next sprint, to tailor it to improvement, then adaptive means nothing.
Yeah, I went through this exercise last Sunday with a class from University of Massachusetts, okay? And we were looking at governance and compliance, but you can see it with tailoring too. You have 3 ceremonies in Agile, right? You have your stand-up, you have your review, and you have your retrospective. And at the stand-up, you're actually establishing an opportunity to go back and modify the backlog, right? Status, progress, and forecast mission risk. And then during the review cycle, you're working with your stakeholders, and all of a sudden you're giving feedback. and this happens not just at the release level, you're happening in the iterations within the releases.
Right.
And then you have retrospectives at the end of releases, at the end of your iterations, and you're doing the same thing. What went well, what went wrong, and that's where you capture your lessons learned as well as modify this. So you can say that tailoring in Agile is almost as constant as breathing.
Well, so we've been on this about 10 minutes since you asked the question on how you would advise your students. I think tailoring's got to be the easiest aspect to develop confidence for your students because they've been doing it since they became young programmers, if that's where they ended up entering into the computer science field. So yeah, I think they're born to it if they're in the IT business.
Well, and it's not just IT. It's the way we build habits. Yeah. Now that you said that, I'm thinking, isn't tailoring just part of human behavior?
Yeah.
It's an aspect of being lazy and creating habits. And tailoring then, if it's really necessary, tells you I must not just tailor what I'm doing based on my habits. I must also tailor my habits so I get a better result every time. And I see myself like that. And you talked about lessons learned earlier in the show. And I see this as actually tailoring not just for the unique characters of this project, but tailoring for the results of every project moving forward. We're getting into the space of continuous improvement.
Oh, that's interesting. So tailoring really is the impetus for continuous improvement.
Yep, it's definitely a contributor.
I mean, if those 2 guys who are installing my hot water tank, and by the way, I envy people who can work with their hands and figure this stuff out. But if they could tailor on the fly based on an external event that happened to them, not something they caused, surely we who are used to IT solutions or other kinds of solutions, surely we can have the confidence to tailor within our projects.
Yeah. And again, it relies on those deep relationships that you're talking about. You need to be really closely tied to the stakeholders who say, no, that doesn't fit what I'm doing over here. You really have to do it this way. And it's that back and forth defining, these things that are the constraints and the things that are flexible.
Well, and you just spurred something in me. I was going back to my my previous example in transferring one solution from a jurisdiction to another. In one case, we had a demanding, table pounding client stakeholder, senior stakeholder. In the other one, we had a more collaborative, come alongside stakeholder. So even though we were transferring the same solution and tailoring the solution for the new client, we also had to tailor our customer approach to our stakeholders because of their approach to doing business. So tailoring happens everywhere on projects.
Yeah, regardless if you have somebody who are creating those limitations that you have to follow versus somebody who is more receptive to your experts and even your opinion. Yeah. Tailoring is a general tool that applies in both models.
We're probably not quite at the hour, but I think we've exhausted this to the point where I've learned something from this discussion, but I've also enjoyed reminiscing over all of those aspects of tailoring that I've had the privilege and the opportunity to be part of.
And I remind myself when I was looking at the 7th edition of the Body of Knowledge and I saw this mapping of tailoring between the 6th and the 7th edition, I was asking myself, why? Why are they giving it so much real estate inside the book? And I think, you're making it more clear to me why it should be, such a bigger topic.
And it just comes down to common sense. I think we started with that. I think we started with that.
Yeah, common sense and understanding human behavior.
Yeah.
That's exactly right.
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay.
Well, great.
I think we've done well. Thank you so much for this discussion. If people have questions on tailoring or just general project management for you, where can they find you?
Best place is LinkedIn. In fact, I was just, as this was going on, as we were podcasting, I had a LinkedIn request come through. Unfortunately, they just said, I need to talk to you. So please, if you have questions, find us on LinkedIn, find me on LinkedIn, Tim, as well, and ask your question.
Yeah, and the more precise question will provide you a more precise answer.
Yeah, you can find me on Facebook as well, but there you're going to see the huge crab that I was able to catch on my vacation and enjoy for dinner. So,
that's wonderful. That's wonderful.
LinkedIn is my technology outlet. So, yeah.
Very good. Very good. Well, thanks again. Thanks for those of you who are watching this, and we'll continue our conversation.